Chapter 10, Part 2 of The Influence of Sea Power upon History, 1660 to 1783, by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 2. Words of these events was sent to D'Estaing in the West Indies, accompanied by urgent representations of the danger to the Carolinas, and the murmurings of the people against the French, who were accused of forsaking their allies, having rendered them no service, but on the contrary having profited by the cordial help of the Bostonians to refit their crippled fleet. There was a sting of truth in the alleged failure to help, which impelled D'Estaing to disregard the orders actually in his hands to return at once to Europe with certain ships. Instead of obeying them, he sailed for the American coast with 22 ships of the line, having in view two objects: the relief of the Southern States and an attack upon New York in conjunction with Washington's army. Arriving off the coast of Georgia on the 1st of September, D'Estaing took the English wholly at unawares, but the fatal lack of promptness which had previously marked the command of this very daring man again betrayed his good fortune. Dallying at first before Savannah, the fleeting of precious days again brought on a change of conditions, and the approach of the bad weather season impelled him, too slow at first, into a premature assault. In it he displayed his accustomed gallantry, fighting at the head of his column, as did the American general, but the result was a bloody repulse. The siege was raised, and D'Estaing sailed at once for France, not only giving up his project upon New York, but abandoning the Southern States to the enemy. The value of this help from the great sea power of France, thus cruelly dangled before the eyes of the Americans, only to be withdrawn, was shown by the action of the English, who abandoned Newport in the utmost haste when they learned the presence of the French fleet. Withdrawal had been before decided upon, but D'Estaing's coming converted it into flight. After the departure of D'Estaing, which involved that of the whole French fleet, for the ships which did not go back to France returned to the West Indies, the English resumed the attack upon the Southern States, which had for a moment been suspended. The fleet and army left New York for Georgia in the last weeks of 1779, and after assembling at Tybee, moved upon Charleston by way of Edisto. The powerlessness of the Americans upon the sea left this movement unembarrassed, save by single cruisers, which picked up some stragglers, affording another lesson of the petty results of a merely cruising warfare. The siege of Charleston began at the end of March, the English ships soon after passing the bar and Fort Moultrie without serious damage, and anchoring within gunshot of the place. Fort Moultrie was soon and easily reduced by land approaches, and the city itself was surrendered on the 12th of May, after a siege of 40 days. The whole state was then quickly overrun and brought into military subjection. The fragments of D'Estaing's late fleet were joined by a reinforcement from France under the Comte de Guichen, who assumed chief command in the West Indian seas March 22, 1780. The next day he sailed for Sta. Lucia, which he hoped to find unprepared, but a crusty, hard-fighting old admiral of the traditional English type, Sir Hyde Parker, had so settled himself at the anchorage with 16 ships that Guichen with his 22 would not attack. The opportunity, if it were one, did not recur. De Guichen, returning to Martinique, anchored there on the 27th, and the same day Parker at Sta. Lucia was joined by the new English commander-in-chief, Rodney. This since celebrated, but then only distinguished admiral was 62 years old at the time of assuming a command where he was to win an undying fame. Of distinguished courage and professional skill, but with extravagant, if not irregular habits, money embarrassments had detained him in exile in France at the time the war began. A boast of his ability to deal with the French fleet, if circumstances enabled him to go back to England, led a French nobleman who heard it to assume his debts, moved by feelings in which chivalry and national pique probably bore equal shares. Upon his return he was given a command and sailed in January 1780 with a fleet of 20 ships of the line to relieve Gibraltar, then closely invested. Off Cadiz, with a good luck for which he was proverbial, he fell in with a Spanish fleet of 11 ships of the line, which awkwardly held their ground until too late to fly. Throwing out the signal for a general chase, and cutting into leeward of the enemy between them and their port, Rodney, despite a dark and stormy night, succeeded in blowing up one ship and taking 6. Hastening on, he relieved Gibraltar, placing it out of all danger from want, and then, leaving the prizes and the bulk of his fleet, sailed with the rest for his station. Despite his brilliant personal courage and professional skill, which in the matter of tactics was far in advance of his contemporaries in England, Rodney, as a commander-in-chief, belongs rather to the wary, cautious school of the French tacticians than to the impetuous, unbounded eagerness of Nelson. As in Tourville we have seen the desperate fighting of the 17th century, unwilling to leave its enemy, merging into the formal, artificial, we may almost say trifling, parade tactics of the 18th. So in Rodney we shall see the transition from those ceremonious duels to an action which, while skilful in conception, aimed at serious results. For it would be unjust to Rodney to press the comparison to the French admirals of his day, with a skill that De Guichen recognized as soon as they crossed swords. Rodney meant mischief, not idle flourishes. Whatever incidental favors fortune might bestow by the way, the objective from which his eye never wandered was the French fleet, the organized military force of the enemy on the sea. And on the day when fortune forsook the opponent who had neglected her offers, when the conqueror of Cornwallis failed to strike while he had Rodney at a disadvantage, the latter won a victory which redeemed England from the depths of anxiety, and restored to her by one blow all those islands which the cautious tactics of the allies had for a moment gained, save only Tobago. De Guichen and Rodney met for the first time on the 17th of April, 1780, 3 weeks after the arrival of the latter. The French fleet was beating to windward in the channel between Martinique and Dominica, when the enemy was made in the southeast. A day was spent in manoeuvring for the weather gage, which Rodney got, the two fleets being now well to leeward of the islands, both on the starboard tack heading to the northward, and the French on the lee bow of the English. Rodney, who was carrying a press of sail, signaled to his fleet that he meant to attack the enemy's rear and centre with his whole force, and when he had reached the position he thought suitable, ordered them to keep away 8 points, 90 degrees together. De Guichen, seeing the danger of the rear, wore his fleet all together and stood down to succor it. Rodney, finding himself foiled, hauled up again on the same tack as the enemy, both fleets now heading to the southward and eastward. Later he again made signal for battle, followed an hour after, just at noon, by the order, quoting his own despatch, for every ship to bear down and steer for her opposite in the enemy's line. This, which sounds like the old story of ship to ship, Rodney explains to have meant her opposite at the moment, not her opposite in numerical order. His own words are, "In a slanting position, that my leading ships might attack the van ships of the enemy's centre division, and the whole British fleet be opposed to only two-thirds of the enemy." The difficulty and misunderstanding which followed seem to have sprung mainly from the defective character of the signal book. Instead of doing as the admiral wished, the leading ships carried sail so as to reach their supposed station abreast their numerical opposite in the order. Rodney stated afterward that when he bore down the second time, the French fleet was in a very extended line of battle, and that, had his orders been obeyed, the centre and rear must have been disabled before the van could have joined. There seems every reason to believe that Rodney's intentions throughout were to double on the French, as asserted. The failure sprang from the signal book and tactical inefficiency of the fleet, for which he, having lately joined, was not answerable; but the ugliness of his fence was so apparent to De Guichen that he exclaimed, when the English fleet kept away the first time, that 6 or 7 of his ships were gone, and sent word to Rodney that if his signals had been obeyed he would have had him for his prisoner. A more convincing proof that he recognized the dangerousness of his enemy is to be found in the fact that he took care not to have the lee gage in their subsequent encounters. Rodney's careful plans being upset, he showed that with them he carried all the stubborn courage of the most downright fighter, taking his own ship close to the enemy and ceasing only when the latter hauled off, her foremast and mainyard gone, and her hull so damaged that she could hardly be kept afloat. An incident of this battle mentioned by French writers and by Botta, who probably drew upon French authorities, but not found in the English accounts, shows the critical nature of the attack in the apprehension of the French. According to them, Rodney, marking a gap in their order, due to a ship in rear of the French admiral being out of station, tried to break through; but the captain of the Destin, 74, pressed up under more sail and threw himself across the path of the English 90-gun ship. The action of the Destin was justly praised, says La Pérouse Bonfils. The fleet ran the danger of almost certain defeat but for the bravery of M. de Guampi. Such, after the affair, was the opinion of the whole French squadron. Yet, admitting that our line was broken, what disasters then would necessarily threaten the fleet? Would it not always have been easy for our rear to remedy the accident by promptly standing on to fill the place of the vessels cut off? That movement would necessarily have brought about a mêlée, which would have turned to the advantage of the fleet, having the bravest and most devoted captains. But then, as under the Empire, it was an acknowledged principle that ships cut off were ships taken, and the belief wrought its own fulfillment. The effect of breaking an enemy's line or order of battle depends upon several conditions. The essential idea is to divide the opposing force by penetrating through an interval found or made in it, and then to concentrate upon that one of the fractions which can be least easily helped by the other. In a column of ships this will usually be the rear. The compactness of the order attacked, the number of the ships cut off, the length of time during which they can be isolated and outnumbered, will all affect the results. A very great factor in the issue will be the moral effect, the confusion introduced into a line thus broken. Ships coming up toward the break are stopped, the rear doubles up, while the ships ahead continue their course. Such a moment is critical and calls for instant action; but the men are rare who, in an unforeseen emergency, can see and at once take the right course, especially if, being subordinates, they incur responsibility. In such a scene of confusion, the English, without presumption, hoped to profit by their better seamanship, for it is not only courage and devotion, but skill, which then tells. All these effects of breaking the line received illustration in Rodney's great battle in 1782. De Guichen and Rodney met twice again in the following month, but on neither occasion did the French admiral take the favorite lee gage of his nation. Meanwhile, a Spanish fleet of 12 ships of the line was on its way to join the French. Rodney cruised to windward of Martinique to intercept them, but the Spanish admiral kept a northerly course, sighted Guadeloupe, and thence sent a despatch to De Guichen, who joined his allies and escorted them into port. The great preponderance of the coalition in numbers raised the fears of the English islands; but lack of harmony led to delays and hesitations. A terrible epidemic raged in the Spanish squadron, and the intended operations came to nothing. In August, De Guichen sailed for France with 15 ships. Rodney, ignorant of his destination and anxious about both North America and Jamaica, divided his fleet, leaving one half in the islands, and with the remainder sailing for New York, where he arrived on the 12th of September. The risk thus run was very great and scarcely justifiable. But no ill effect followed the dispersal of forces. Had De Guichen intended to turn upon Jamaica, or, as was expected by Washington, upon New York, neither part of Rodney's fleet could well have withstood him. 2 chances of disaster instead of 1 were run by being in small force on 2 fields instead of in full force on 1. Rodney's anxiety about North America was well grounded. On the 12th of July of this year the long-expected French succor arrived. 5,000 French troops under Rochambeau and 7 ships of the line under de Tournay. Hence the English, though still superior at sea, felt forced to concentrate at New York, and were unable to strengthen their operations in Carolina. The difficulty and distance of movements by land gave such an advantage to sea power that Lafayette urged the French government further to increase the fleet; but it was still naturally and properly attentive to its own immediate interests in the Antilles. It was not yet time to deliver America. Rodney, having escaped the great hurricane of October, 1780, by his absence, returned to the West Indies later in the year, and soon after heard of the war between England and Holland, which, proceeding from causes which will be mentioned later, was declared December 20, 1780. The admiral at once seized the Dutch islands of St. Eustatius and St. Martin, besides numerous merchant ships, with property amounting in all to $15,000,000. These islands, while still neutral, had played a role similar to that of Nassau during the American Civil War, and had become a great depot of contraband goods, immense quantities of which now fell into the English hands. The year 1780 had been gloomy for the cause of the United States. The Battle of Camden had seemed to settle the English yoke on South Carolina, and the enemy formed high hopes of controlling both North Carolina and Virginia. The treason of Arnold following had increased the depression, which was but partially relieved by the victory at Kings Mountain. The substantial aid of French troops was the most cheerful spot in the situation, yet even that had a checkered light, the second division of the intended help being blocked in Brest by the English fleet, while the final failure of De Guichen to appear, and Rodney coming in his stead, made the hopes of the campaign fruitless. A period of vehement and decisive action was, however, at hand. At the end of March, 1781, the Comte de Grasse sailed from Brest with 26 ships of the line and a large convoy. When off the Azores, 5 ships parted company for the East Indies under Suffren, of whom more will be heard later on. De Grasse came in sight of Martinique on the 28th of April. Admiral Hood, Rodney having remained behind at St. Eustatius, was blockading before Fort Royal, the French port and arsenal on the lee side of the island, in which were 4 ships of the line, when his lookouts reported the enemy's fleet. Hood had 2 objects before him: one to prevent the junction of the 4 blockaded ships with the approaching fleet, the other to keep the latter from getting between him and Gros Ilot Bay in Sta. Lucia. Instead of effecting this in the next 24 hours by beating to windward of the Diamond Rock, his fleet got so far to leeward that De Grasse, passing through the Channel on the 29th, headed up for Fort Royal, keeping his convoy between the fleet and the island. For this false position Hood was severely blamed by Rodney, but it may have been due to light winds and the lee current. However that be, the 4 ships in Fort Royal got under way and joined the main body. The English had now only 18 ships to the French 24, and the latter were to windward; but though thus in the proportion of 4 to 3, and having the power to attack, De Grasse would not do it. The fear of exposing his convoy prevented him from running the chance of a serious engagement. Great must have been his distrust of his forces, one would say. When is a navy to fight, if this was not a time? He carried on a distant cannonade, with results so far against the English as to make his backwardness yet more extraordinary. Can a policy or a tradition which justifies such a line of conduct be good? The following day, April 30, De Grasse, having thrown away his chance, attempted to follow Hood, but the latter had no longer any reason for fighting, and his original inferiority was increased by the severe injuries of some ships on the 29th. De Grasse could not overtake him, owing to the inferior speed of his fleet, many of the ships not being coppered, a fact worthy of note, as French vessels by model and size were generally faster than English; but this superiority was sacrificed through the delay of the government in adopting the new improvement. Hood rejoined Rodney at Antigua, and De Grasse, after remaining a short time at Fort Royal, made an attempt upon Gros Ilot Bay, the possession of which by the English kept all the movements of his fleet under surveillance. Foiled here, he moved against Tobago, which surrendered June 2, 1781. Sailing thence, after some minor operations, he anchored on the 26th of July at Cap Française, now Cape Haitien, in the island of Haiti. Here he found awaiting him a French frigate from the United States, bearing dispatches from Washington and Rochambeau, upon which he was to take the most momentous action that fell to any French admiral during the war. The invasion of the Southern States by the English, beginning in Georgia and followed by the taking of Charleston and the military control of the 2 extreme States, had been pressed on to the northward by way of Camden into North Carolina. On the 16th of August, 1780, General Gates was totally defeated at Camden, and during the following 9 months the English under Cornwallis persisted in their attempts to overrun North Carolina. These operations, the narration of which is foreign to our immediate subject, had ended by forcing Cornwallis, despite many successes in actual encounter, to fall back exhausted toward the seaboard, and finally upon Wilmington, in which place depots for such a contingency had been established. His opponent, General Greene, then turned the American troops toward South Carolina. Cornwallis, too weak to dream of controlling or even penetrating into the interior of an unfriendly country, had now to choose between returning to Charleston to assure there and in South Carolina the shaken British power, and moving northward again into Virginia, there to join hands with a small expeditionary force operating on the James River under Generals Phillips and Arnold. To fall back would be a confession that the weary marching and fighting of months past had been without results, and the general readily convinced himself that the Chesapeake was the proper seat of war, even if New York itself had to be abandoned. The commander-in-chief, Sir Henry Clinton, by no means shared this opinion, upon which was justified a step taken without asking him. "Operations in the Chesapeake," he wrote, "are attended with great risk unless we are sure of a permanent superiority at sea. I tremble for the fatal consequences that may ensue." For Cornwallis, taking the matter into his own hands, had marched from Wilmington on the 25th of April, 1781, joining the British already at Petersburg on the 20th of May. The forces thus united numbered 7,000 men. Driven back from the open country of South Carolina into Charleston, there now remained two centers of British power, at New York and in the Chesapeake. With New Jersey and Pennsylvania in the hands of the Americans, communication between the two depended wholly upon the sea. Despite his unfavorable criticism of Cornwallis's action, Clinton had himself already risked a large detachment in the Chesapeake. A body of 1,600 men under Benedict Arnold had ravaged the country of the James and burned Richmond in January of this same year. In the hopes of capturing Arnold, Lafayette had been sent to Virginia with a nucleus of 1,200 troops, and on the evening of the 8th of March the French squadron at Newport sailed in concerted movement to control the waters of the bay. Admiral Arbuthnot, commanding the English fleet lying in Gardiner's Bay, learned the departure by his lookouts, and started in pursuit on the morning of the 10th, 36 hours later. Favored either by diligence or luck, he made such good time that when the two fleets came in sight of each other, a little outside of the capes of the Chesapeake, the English were leading. They at once went about to meet their enemy, who on his part formed a line of battle. The wind at this time was west, so that neither could head directly into the bay. The two fleets were nearly equal in strength, there being 8 ships on each side; but the English had one 90-gun ship, while of the French one was only a heavy frigate, which was put into the line. Nevertheless, the case was eminently one for the general French policy to have determined the action of a vigorous chief, and the failure to see the matter through must fall upon the goodwill of Commodore Destouches, or upon some other cause than that preference for the ulterior objects of the operation of which the reader of French naval history hears so much. The weather was boisterous and threatening, and the wind, after hauling once or twice, settled down to northeast with a big sea, but was then fair for entering the bay. The two fleets were by this time both on the port tack, standing out to sea, the French leading, and about a point on the weather bow of the English. From this position they wore in succession ahead of the latter, taking the lee gage, and thus gaining the use of their lower batteries, which the heavy sea forbade to the weather gage. The English stood on till abreast the enemy's line, when they wore together, and soon after attacked in the usual manner and with the usual results. The 3 van ships were very badly injured aloft, but in their turn, throwing their force mainly on the 2 leaders of the enemy, crippled them seriously in hulls and rigging. The French van then kept away, and Arbuthnot, in perplexity, ordered his van to haul the wind again. Monsieur Destouches now executed a very neat movement by defiling. Signaling his van to haul up on the other tack, he led the rest of his squadron by the disabled English ships, and after giving them the successive broadsides of his comparatively fresh ships, wore and out to sea. This was the end of the battle, in which the English certainly got the worst, but with their usual tenacity of purpose, being unable to pursue their enemy afloat, they steered for the bay, made the junction with Arnold, and thus broke up the plans of the French and Americans, from which so much had been hoped by Washington. There can be no doubt, after careful reading of the accounts, that after the fighting the French were in better force than the English, and they in fact claimed the victory; yet the ulterior objects of the expedition did not tempt them again to try the issue with a fleet of about their own size. The way of the sea being thus open and held in force, 2,000 more English troops sailing from New York reached Virginia on the 26th of March, and the subsequent arrival of Cornwallis in May raised the number to 7,000. The operations of the contending forces during the spring and summer months, in which Lafayette commanded the Americans, do not concern our subject. Early in August, Cornwallis, acting under orders from Clinton, withdrew his troops into the peninsula between the York and James rivers, and occupied Yorktown. Washington and Rochambeau had met on the 21st of May, and decided that the situation demanded that the effort of the French West Indian fleet, when it came, should be directed against either New York or the Chesapeake. This was the tenor of the dispatch found by De Grasse at Cap Français, and meantime the allied generals drew their troops toward New York, where they would be on hand for the furtherance of one object, and nearer the second if they had to make for it. In either case, the result, in the opinion both of Washington and of the French government, depended upon superior sea power; but Rochambeau had privately notified the admiral that his own preference was for the Chesapeake as the scene of the intended operations, and moreover the French government had declined to furnish the means for a formal siege of New York. The enterprise therefore assumed the form of an extensive military combination, dependent upon ease and rapidity of movement, and upon blinding the eyes of the enemy to the real objective, purposes to which the peculiar qualities of a navy admirably lent themselves. The shorter distance to be traversed, the greater depth of water, and easier pilotage of the Chesapeake, were further reasons which would commend the scheme to the judgment of a seaman, and De Grasse readily accepted it, without making difficulties or demanding modifications which would have involved discussion and delay. Having made his decision, the French admiral acted with great good judgment, promptitude, and vigor. The same frigate that brought despatches from Washington was sent back, so that by August 15th the allied generals knew of the intended coming of the fleet. 3,500 soldiers were spared by the governor of Cap Français upon the condition of a Spanish squadron anchoring at the place, which De Grasse procured. He also raised from the governor of Havana the money urgently needed by the Americans, and finally, instead of weakening his force by sending envoys to France, as the court had wished, he took every available ship to the Chesapeake. To conceal his coming as long as possible, he passed through the Bahama Channel as a less frequented route, and on the 30th of August anchored in Lynnhaven Bay, just within the capes of the Chesapeake, with 28 ships of the line. 3 days before, August 27, the French squadron at Newport, 8 ships of the line with 4 frigates and 18 transports under M. de Barras, sailed for the rendezvous, making, however, a wide circuit out to sea to avoid the English. This course was the more necessary as the French siege artillery was with it. The troops under Washington and Rochambeau had crossed the Hudson on the 24th of August, moving toward the head of Chesapeake Bay. Thus the different armed forces, both land and sea, were converging toward their objective, Cornwallis. The English were unfortunate in all directions. Rodney, learning of De Grasse's departure, sent 14 ships of the line under Admiral Hood to North America, and himself sailed for England in August on account of ill health. Hood, going by the direct route, reached the Chesapeake 3 days before De Grasse, looked into the bay, and finding it empty, went on to New York. There he met 5 ships of the line under Admiral Graves, who, being senior officer, took command of the whole force, and sailed on the 31st of August for the Chesapeake, hoping to intercept de Barras before he could join De Grasse. It was not till 2 days later that Sir Henry Clinton was persuaded that the allied armies had gone against Cornwallis and had too far the start to be overtaken. Admiral Graves was painfully surprised on making the Chesapeake to find anchored there a fleet which from its numbers could only be an enemy's. Nevertheless, he stood in to meet it, and as De Grasse got under way, allowing his ships to be counted, the sense of numerical inferiority, 19 to 24, did not deter the English admiral from attacking. The clumsiness of his method, however, betrayed his gallantry. Many of his ships were roughly handled, without any advantage being gained. De Grasse, expecting de Barras, remained outside 5 days, keeping the English fleet in play without coming to action. Then, returning to port, he found de Barras safely at anchor. Graves went back to New York, and with him disappeared the last hope of succor that was to gladden Cornwallis's eyes. The siege was steadily endured, but the control of the sea made only one issue possible, and the English forces were surrendered October 19, 1781. With this disaster, the hope of subduing the colonies died in England. The conflict flickered through a year longer, but no serious operations were undertaken. In the conduct of the English operations, which ended thus unfortunately, there was both bad management and ill fortune. Hood's detachment might have been strengthened by several ships from Jamaica, had Rodney's orders been carried out. The dispatch ship also, sent by him to Admiral Graves, commanding in New York, found that officer absent on a cruise to the eastward, with a view to intercept certain very important supplies which had been forwarded by the American agent in France. The English court had laid great stress upon cutting off this convoy, but with the knowledge that he had of the force accompanying it, the admiral was probably ill-advised in leaving his headquarters himself with all his fleet at the time when the approach of the hurricane season in the West Indies directed the active operations of the navies toward the continent. In consequence of his absence, although Rodney's dispatches were at once sent on by the senior officer in New York, the vessel carrying them being driven ashore by enemy's cruisers, Graves did not learn their contents until his return to port, August 16. The information sent by Hood of his coming was also intercepted. After Hood's arrival, it does not appear that there was avoidable delay in going to sea, but there does seem to have been misjudgment in the direction given to the fleet. It was known that de Barras had sailed from Newport with 8 ships, bound probably for the Chesapeake, certainly to effect a junction with De Grasse, and it has been judiciously pointed out that if Graves had taken up his cruising ground near the Capes, but out of sight of land, he could hardly have failed to fall in with him in overwhelming force. Knowing what is now known, this would undoubtedly have been the proper thing to do, but the English admiral had imperfect information. It was nowhere expected that the French would bring nearly the force they did, and Graves lost information which he ought to have received as to their numbers by the carelessness of his cruisers stationed off the Chesapeake. These had been ordered to keep under way, but were both at anchor under Cape Henry when De Grasse's appearance cut off their escape. One was captured, the other driven up York River. No single circumstance contributed more to the general result than the neglect of these two subordinate officers, by which Graves lost that all-important information. It can readily be conceived how his movements might have been affected had he known 2 days earlier that De Grasse had brought 27 or 28 sail of the line; how natural would have been the conclusion, first, to waylay De Barras, with whom his own 19 could more than cope. Had Admiral Graves succeeded in capturing that squadron, it would have greatly paralyzed the besieging army. It had the siege train on board. If it would not have prevented its operations altogether, it would have put the two fleets nearly on an equality in point of numbers, would have arrested the progress of the French arms for the ensuing year in the West Indies, and might possibly have created such a spirit of discord between the French and Americans as would have sunk the latter into the lowest depths of despair, from which they were only extricated by the arrival of the forces under De Grasse. These are true and sober comments upon the naval strategy. In regard to the admiral's tactics, it will be enough to say that the fleet was taken into battle nearly as Byng took his, that very similar mishaps resulted, and that when attacking 24 ships with 19, 7 under that capable officer Hood were not able to get into action owing to the dispositions made. On the French side, De Grasse must be credited with a degree of energy, foresight, and determination surprising in view of his failures at other times. The decision to take every ship with him, which made him independent of any failure on the part of De Barras, the passage through the Bahama Channel to conceal his movements, the address with which he obtained the money and troops required from the Spanish and the French military authorities, the prevision which led him, as early as March 29, shortly after leaving Brest, to write to Rochambeau that American coast pilots should be sent to Cap Français, the coolness with which he kept Graves amused until De Brasse's squadron had slipped in, are all points worthy of admiration. The French were also helped by the admiral's power to detain the 200 merchant ships, the West India trade awaiting convoy at Cap Français, where they remained from July till November, when the close of operations left him at liberty to convoy them with ships of war. The incident illustrates one weakness of a mercantile country with representative government compared with a purely military nation. If the British government, wrote an officer of that day, had sanctioned, or a British admiral had adopted such a measure, the one would have been turned out and the other hanged. Rodney, at the same time, had felt it necessary to detach 5 ships of the line with convoys, while half a dozen more went home with the trade from Jamaica. It is easier to criticize the division of the English fleet between the West Indies and North America in the successive years 1780 and 1781 than to realize the embarrassment of the situation. This embarrassment was but the reflection of the military difficulty of England's position all over the world in this great and unequal war. England was everywhere outmatched and embarrassed, as she has always been as an empire, by the number of her exposed points. In Europe, the Channel fleet was more than once driven into its ports by overwhelming forces. Gibraltar, closely blockaded by land and sea, was only kept alive in its desperate resistance by the skill of English seamen triumphing over the inaptness and discords of their combined enemies. In the East Indies, Sir Edward Hughes met in Suffren an opponent as superior to him in numbers as was De Grasse to Hood, and of far greater ability. Minorca, abandoned by the home government, fell before superior strength, as has been seen to fall one by one the less important of the English Antilles. The position of England, from the time that France and Spain opened their maritime war, was everywhere defensive except in North America, and was therefore, from the military point of view, essentially false. She everywhere awaited attacks which the enemy, superior in every case, could make at their own choice and their own time. North America was really no exception to this rule, despite some offensive operations which in no way injured her real, that is, her naval foes. Thus situated, and putting aside questions of national pride or sensitiveness, what did military wisdom prescribe to England? The question would afford an admirable study to a military inquirer, and is not to be answered offhand, but certain evident truths may be pointed out. In the first place, it should have been determined what part of the assailed empire was most necessary to be preserved. After the British islands themselves, the North American colonies were the most valuable possessions in the eyes of the England of that day. Next should have been decided what others by their natural importance were best worth preserving, and by their own inherent strength, or that of the empire, which was mainly naval strength, could most surely be held. In the Mediterranean, for instance, Gibraltar and Mahan were both very valuable positions. Could both be held? Which was more easily to be reached and supported by the fleet? If both could not probably be held, one should have been frankly abandoned, and the force and efforts necessary to its defence carried elsewhere. So in the West Indies, the evident strategic advantages of Barbadoes and St. Lucia prescribed the abandonment of the other small islands by garrisons as soon as the fleet was fairly outnumbered, if not before. The case of so large an island as Jamaica must be studied separately, as well as with reference to the general question. Such an island may be so far self-supporting as to defy any attack, but one in great force and numbers, and that would rightly draw to it the whole English force from the windward stations at Barbadoes and St. Lucia. With the defence thus concentrated, England's great weapon, the navy, should have been vigorously used on the offensive. Experience has taught that free nations, popular governments, will seldom dare wholly to remove the force that lies between an invader and its shores or capital. Whatever the military wisdom, therefore, of sending the Channel fleet to seek the enemy before it united, the step may not have been possible; but at points less vital the attack of the English should have anticipated that of the allies. This was most especially true of that theatre of the war which has so far been considered. If North America was the first object, Jamaica and the other islands should have been boldly risked. It is due to Rodney to say that he claims that his orders to the admirals at Jamaica and New York were disobeyed in 1781, and that to this was owing the inferiority in number of Graves's fleet. But why in 1780, when the departure of de Guichen for Europe left Rodney markedly superior in numbers during his short visit to North America from September 14 to November 14, should no attempt have been made to destroy the French detachment of 7 ships of the line in Newport? These ships had arrived there in July, but although they had at once strengthened their position by earthworks, great alarm was excited by the news of Rodney's appearance off the coast. A fortnight passed by Rodney in New York, and by the French in busy work, placed the latter, in their own opinion, in a position to brave all the naval force of England. "We twice feared, and above all at the time of Rodney's arrival," wrote the chief of staff of the French squadron, "that the English might attack us in the road itself, and there was a space of time during which such an undertaking would not have been an act of rashness. Now, October 20, the anchorage is fortified so that we can there brave all the naval force of England." The position thus taken by the French was undoubtedly very strong. It formed a re-entrant angle of a little over 90 degrees, contained by lines drawn from Goat Island to what was then called Brenton's Point, the site of the present Fort Adams, on the one side, and to Rose Island on the other. On the right flank of the position Rose Island received a battery of 36 24-pounders, while 12 guns of the same size were placed on the left flank at Brenton's Point. Between Rose and Goat Islands, 4 ships drawn up on a west-northwest line bore upon the entrance and raked an approaching fleet, while 3 others between Goat Island and Brenton's Point crossed their fire at right angles with the former 4. On the other hand, the summer winds blow directly up the entrance, often with great force. There could be no question even of a considerably crippled attacking ship reaching her destined position, and when once confused with the enemy's line, the shore batteries would be neutralized. The work on Rose Island, certainly, that on Brenton's Point probably, had less height than the 2 upper batteries of a ship of the line, and could be vastly outnumbered. They could not have been casemated, and might indisputably have been silenced by the grape shot of the ships that could have been brought against them. Rose Island could be approached on the front and on the west flank within 200 yards, and on the north within half a mile. There was nothing to prevent this right flank of the French, including the line of ships, being enfiladed and crushed by the English ships taking position west of Rose Island. The essential points of close range and superior height were thus possible to the English fleet, which numbered 20 to the enemy's 7. If successful in destroying the shipping and reducing Rose Island, it could find anchorage farther up the bay and await a favorable wind to retire. In the opinion of a distinguished English naval officer of the day, closely familiar with the ground, there was no doubt of the success of an attack, and he urged it frequently upon Rodney, offering himself to pilot the leading ship. The security felt by the French in this position, and the acquiescence of the English in that security, marked clearly the difference in spirit between this war and the wars of Nelson and Napoleon. It is not, however, merely as an isolated operation, but in relation to the universal war, that such an attempt is here considered. England stood everywhere on the defensive, with inferior numbers. From such a position there is no salvation except by action vigorous almost to desperation. "It is impossible for us," wrote with great truth the First Lord of the Admiralty to Rodney, "to have a superior fleet in every part; and unless our commanders in chief will take the great line as you do, and consider the king's whole dominions under their care, our enemies must find us unprepared somewhere, and carry their point against us." Attacks which, considered in themselves alone, might be thought unjustifiable, were imposed upon English commanders. The allied navy was the key of the situation, and its large detachments, as at Newport, should have been crushed at any risk. The effect of such a line of action upon the policy of the French government is a matter of speculation, as to which the present writer has no doubts; but no English officer in chief command rose to the level of the situation, with the exception of Hood and possibly of Howe. Rodney was now old, infirm, and though of great ability, a careful tactician rather than a great admiral. The defeat of Graves and subsequent surrender of Cornwallis did not end the naval operations in the Western Hemisphere. On the contrary, one of the most interesting tactical feats and the most brilliant victory of the whole war were yet to grace the English flag in the West Indies; but with the events at Yorktown the patriotic interest for Americans closes. Before quitting that struggle for independence, it must again be affirmed that its successful ending, at least at so early a date, was due to the control of the sea, to sea power in the hands of the French, and its improper distribution by the English authorities. This assertion may be safely rested on the authority of the one man who, above all others, thoroughly knew the resources of the country, the temper of the people, the difficulties of the struggle, and whose name is still the highest warrant for sound, quiet, unfluttered good sense and patriotism. The key note to all Washington's utterances is set in the memorandum for concerting a plan of operations with the French army, dated July 15, 1780, and sent by the hands of Lafayette. The Marquis de Lafayette will be pleased to communicate the following general ideas to Count de Rochambeau and the Chevalier de Ternay as the sentiments of the underwritten. 1. In any operation and under all circumstances, a decisive naval superiority is to be considered as a fundamental principle and the basis upon which every hope of success must ultimately depend. This, however, though the most formal and decisive expression of Washington's views, is but one among many others equally distinct. Thus, writing to Franklin, December 20, 1780, he says: "Disappointed of the second division of French troops blockaded in Brest, but more especially in the expected naval superiority, which was the pivot upon which everything turned, we have been compelled to spend an inactive campaign after a flattering prospect at the opening of it. Latterly, we have been obliged to become spectators of a succession of detachments from the army at New York in aid of Lord Cornwallis, while our naval weakness and the political dissolution of a large part of our army put it out of our power to counteract them at the southward or to take advantage of them here." A month later, January 15, 1781, in a memorandum letter to Colonel Lorenz, sent on a special mission to France, he says: "Next to a loan of money, a constant naval superiority upon these coasts is the object most interesting. This would instantly reduce the enemy to a difficult defensive. Indeed, it is not to be conceived how they could subsist a large force in this country if we had the command of the seas to interrupt the regular transmission of supplies from Europe. This superiority, with an aid in money, would enable us to convert the war into a vigorous offensive. With respect to us, it seems to be one of two deciding points." In another letter to the same person, then in Paris, dated April 9, he writes: "If France delays a timely and powerful aid in the critical posture of our affairs, it will avail us nothing should she attempt it hereafter. Why need I run into detail, when it may be declared, in a word, that we are at the end of our tether, and that now or never our deliverance must come? How easy would it be to retort the enemy's own game upon them, if it could be made to comport with the general plan of the war to keep a superior fleet always in these seas, and France would put us in condition to be active by advancing us money." Ships and money are the burden of his cry. May 23, 1781, he writes to the Chevalier de la Luzerne: "I do not see how it is possible to give effectual support to the Southern States, and avert the evils which threaten, while we are inferior in naval force in these seas." As the season for active operations advances, his utterances are more frequent and urgent. To Major General Greene, struggling with his difficulties in South Carolina, he writes, June 1, 1781, "Our affairs have been attentively considered in every point of view, and it was finally determined to make an attempt upon New York in preference to a Southern operation, as we had not decided command of the water." To Jefferson, June 8, "Should I be supported in the manner I expect by the neighboring States, the enemy will, I hope, be reduced to the necessity of recalling part of their force from the southward to support New York, or they will run the most imminent risk of being expelled from that post, which is to them invaluable. And should we, by a lucky coincidence of circumstances, gain a naval superiority, their ruin would be inevitable. While we remain inferior at sea, policy dictates that relief should be attempted by diversion rather than by sending reinforcements immediately to the point in distress, that is, to the south." To Rochambeau, June 13, "Your Excellency will recollect that New York was looked upon by us as the only practicable object under present circumstances; but should we be able to secure a naval superiority, we may perhaps find others more practicable and equally advisable." By the 15th of August, the letters of De Grasse, announcing his sailing for the Chesapeake, were received, and the correspondence of Washington is thenceforth filled with busy preparations for the campaign in Virginia, based upon the long delayed fleet. The discouragement of De Grasse, and his purpose to go to sea, upon learning that the English fleet in New York had been reinforced, drew forth an appealing letter dated September 25th, which is too long for quotation. But the danger past, Washington's confidence returns. The day after the capitulation, he writes to De Grasse: "The surrender of York, the honor of which belongs to your Excellency, has greatly anticipated in time our most sanguine anticipations." He then goes on to urge further operations in the South, seeing so much of the good season was still left. "The general naval superiority of the British, previous to your arrival, gave them decisive advantages in the South in the rapid transport of their troops and supplies; while the immense land marches of our succors, too tardy and expensive in every point of view, subjected us to be beaten in detail. It will depend upon your Excellency, therefore, to terminate the war." De Grasse refusing this request, but intimating an intention to cooperate in the next year's campaign, Washington instantly accepts. "With your Excellency, I need not insist upon the indispensable necessity of a maritime force capable of giving you an absolute ascendency in these seas. You will have observed that, whatever efforts are made by the land armies, the navy must have the casting vote in the present contest." A fortnight later, November 15, he writes to Lafayette, who is on the point of sailing for France: "As you expressed a desire to know my sentiments respecting the operations of the next campaign, I will, without a tedious display of reasoning, declare in one word that it must depend absolutely upon the naval force which is employed in these seas, and the time of its appearance next year. No land force can act decisively unless accompanied by a maritime superiority. A doubt did not exist, nor does it at this moment, in any man's mind, of the total extirpation of the British force in the Carolinas and Georgia, if Count de Grasse could have extended his cooperation 2 months longer." Such, in the opinion of the revered commander in chief of the American armies, was the influence of sea power upon the contests which he directed with so much skill and such infinite patience, and which, amidst countless trials and discouragements, he brought to a glorious close. It will be observed that the American cause was reduced to these straits, notwithstanding the great and admitted losses of British commerce, by the cruisers of the allies and by American privateers. This fact, and the small results from the general war, dominated as it was by the idea of commerce destroying, show strongly the secondary and indecisive effect of such a policy upon the great issues of war. End of Chapter 10, Part 2.